Jayne Ozanne, welcome to Acting Prime Minister, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks, Paul.
And we've known each other for about 3 years now, haven't we? Because we've both been caught up in this huge story, as it's become, about conversion therapy and all the ups and downs along the way of, being promised a ban, and then there was the fear of rowing back on a ban, and then yesterday Her Majesty the Queen actually used the phrase conversion therapy. I mean, that must have been quite a surreal moment for you after all this time.
It was utterly surreal. And I think the honest truth is I actually missed it. I was listening in Westminster to the speech, sort of settling down, and somebody had to text me and said, that was it. And I went back and I replayed it and I replayed it. And I actually thought, gosh, we have the Queen saying that measures will be brought forward to. And I must admit, I did shed a tear, because I know we're by no means at the end of the road, but that was a significant step. And Paul, I need to pay honour to you. Thank you for covering my story and others and the campaign over the years, because I think it's only by actually bringing this into the spotlight for people to truly understand this is happening today, and that people are being abused and we need protections, that we got to that point of yesterday with the Queen saying what she did.
Well, thank you for that, but not at all. I mean, it's the stories that you guys have been telling that has been the powerful testimony, I think, that's really brought and shone a light on this area. And there's a lot about yesterday's announcement. So this was the Queen's speech setting out the legislative programme that the government wants to push through. There's a lot about the ban that was announced yesterday that's not perfect, so we'll come back to that later. But if you were Prime Minister, let's think about what you'd do now. So let's get you settled into number 10 straight away. And firstly, what's the personal item that you'd like to take with you from home?
Well, I must admit, if it was a live item allowed, I might bring my two cats. But I think what you probably mean is actually, for me, it would be my violin, which is made by my father, who sadly passed in November 19. He was an excellent violin maker, as well as being a fighter pilot. And he taught me the violin. It is something I use to try and relax. I think music is a great healer. And so for me, I'm not sure what your other people in the chair have said, but I think that the number 10 needs to be filled with music, so that we can remember the finer things of life, and that there's beauty at the end of each day.
That sounds lovely. And what would your first meal be, Jayne, in number 10?
Goodness, well, I'm on a strict regime at the moment, so he'd have to keep to that. But luckily, I'm allowed seafood in that regime, so I'm afraid I love the sea. I love seafood. I would probably look for some Italian seafood dish. It's the wine list I'd really like to see. Very nice bottle of wine would be top of my list with that. Okay.
Oh, I hope you invite me round for dinner. And who's the first person that you call as Prime Minister?
It'd have to be my mum, my mother, who's journeyed with me on my own journey of coming to acceptance of my sexuality, but who's walked every step of the way. And yeah, she would be the one I'd want to honour at that wonderful moment.
Oh, lovely. And let's talk a bit about your path to power, as we call it now. So this is a bit about your background here. And you grew up as a practicing Christian on Guernsey in the Channel Islands, and you studied at Cambridge. You studied maths there before having a career in business. And then you talk quite openly about the struggle in your early adult years, in your 20s and 30s and 40s, with your sexuality and the conversion therapy that you were put through, which ultimately led to you having a breakdown in 2008. And then a sort of reawakening and a new life, coming to terms with your sexuality, coming out as gay, and setting up your own foundation, campaigning to end the practice of conversion therapy. And I've interviewed you many, many times as a campaigner, but we've never actually really delved into what happened to you. And I'd really like to do that for the first time. I know it's not always easy to talk about, but why don't we start at the beginning? And I guess, when did you first know that you were attracted to women, and when did you first kind of get anxious about that?
I think I was probably a late developer. As I grew up in Guernsey, as you mentioned, in the Channel Islands, very sheltered, quite conservative upbringing. I knew men could be gay, but I have to be honest, it never crossed my mind that women could be gay, or indeed that I was. And it wasn't until I was living in Paris in around 93, so I was in my mid-20s, where I was working with an extraordinary woman who I just adored being with every second of the day. In fact, that's one of the reasons I'd accepted the move from, I was a European manager, but I'd moved into my biggest marketplace, which was in France. And it meant that we could spend as much time as we'd like together, both at work and frankly, you know, in the evenings. And it was her best friend who took me out after about 4 months and said, when are you going to admit to yourself and everyone else that you're madly in love with this lady? And I was so shocked, but she had named what I knew to be true. And of course, I think that's so often the case for so many of us. We sort of know something, but until it's named, until we're confronted with truth, I think a lot of parents actually are in this place. They deep down, they sort of know that the children might be gay, but they don't want to name it. Yeah, and that sadly triggered a massive internal war for me, because I passionately believed that this was wrong and sinful and not what God required of a good Christian woman like myself. And I couldn't understand why my yearning for love, my yearning for intimacy, my yearning to find someone who I could build a future and a home with, why that would be in the form of someone who was, I would call, forbidden fruit. I thought it was a one-off, and I came back to England. To be honest, various things happened. I don't know how much I went on holiday, as it happened to. I won a trip on Concorde, which I turned into a first-class trip around the world, and went scuba diving on the Great Barrier Reef, and spent a week on a tiny boat, having the time of my life, but met an extraordinary woman who, again, I realized I was falling deeply for. Nothing happened with either of these ladies. And so I thought, gosh, get out of the exotic, come back to London, settle down, find a lovely man, and do the right thing. And I tried that. But when this friend of mine from Australia turned up on her way through London and came to stay, I realized that my feelings for her were of such a different magnitude than this lovely, decent man I'd started dating. And that triggered, sadly, a massive breakdown. The stress levels were very high. I ended up in the Cromwell Hospital, going through all sorts of tests, trying to work out where my body was racked with so much pain. And that then, sadly, led into a full-blown breakdown because of this internal struggle, which I didn't feel I could talk to anybody about. Because to do so, certainly in my church setting, would have been to speak the unspeakable. I would have become, if you like, I think I'd have been put on the theological naughty step, the place where there is no return.
And it was that internal struggle that led you to seek help with your sexuality. I use the word help in inverted commas because it wasn't particularly helpful, as we now know. What did that involve? How did you first end up being sort of drawn into the world of conversion therapy?
Well, yes, help. It's interesting, actually, and I'm going to share this on purpose, but the first person I actually told was my psychiatrist. But her reaction was, well, Jayne, you need to change your faith. And I remember looking at her with utter horror. He was the first person I'd actually braved the words to, and thinking, you really don't get this. I can no longer change my faith as I could my sexuality. And that clamped me up, actually. It meant I didn't talk to anybody in the medical profession or the psychiatric or psychotherapy profession for many years. And instead, I started looking for help from my church. So when I came out and I started sharing with people that this is what I was struggling with, and looking for prayer and what we call prayer counseling, and emotional healing at the time, and even today, there was a deep belief that obviously something must have happened to me to make me become gay, that I'd obviously perhaps not had the best relationships with my parents, or sadly, I've been very open about the fact I was raped by a priest, and well, that must be the reason why. And you go through hours of prayer with people, going through every element of your life, praying into things, getting you to ask forgiveness for people or forgiving people. It's very intense. And yet deep down, when it doesn't work, you're left with the burden of knowing, A, that perhaps you haven't been open enough or you haven't got enough faith, but mostly that you feel ashamed and guilty that the prayer isn't working and there must be something terrible about you.
Mm.
That psychological stress, day in, day out. I mean, we're not talking just a week or a month, we're talking years,
Yeah.
you know? And it's the constant internal struggle of feeling that who you are is wrong and sinful, and that the self-hatred and self-loathing is just immense. Now, I'm a quite robust character, I'd like to think. And I found it horrendous how a young teenager or a young vulnerable adult who's just coming to terms with themselves deals with it.
And because it happens behind closed doors, and actually if you're someone who perhaps doesn't have a faith, this will be completely alien to a lot of people. On a very practical level, what does it involve, conversion therapy? There's lots of different types, but for you, what was happening?
Well, I tend to talk about it in different phases, and I suppose I've just touched. Well, the first phase is a silent phase where you literally do everything you can personally. You don't want to tell anybody, so you plea bargain with God. You might go on fasts. You might say, "Look, if I do this, will you do that?" And that can go on for years, which it did for me for 30 years, until I had a breakdown. And then I started, as I said, reaching out to people in my church who would sit down and pray with me. They would, we're talking about charismatic evangelical churches. So people will put their hands on you. They will pray for a word of knowledge or an insight into what's going on here. What's God going to tell us about what the reason is? So people will think they've got a word of understanding, and that they're often people in authority, in positions of power. So you trust them. You believe that what they're saying is true and proper and right. But then ultimately, I went into phase 3, which many people do, where you start seeking out more specialized ministries. And that means deliverance ministries and exorcisms. And I must have gone through hundreds. I suppose looking back now, I think, gosh, how many demons was I really holding? But of course, the teaching was, well, Jayne, we're getting rid of them, but they're coming back because you're welcoming them back in. And it's a terrible psychological place to be. Like to think I'm quite a well-educated, woman. But I did believe this because that is what I'm being taught by, people I truly respected and trusted. This is pretty standard mainstream evangelical church teaching. And so deliverance ministries can take many forms. You've got to understand, mostly, not all, will be done by people who really love you, want the best for you, but they think they're addressing the devil in you. So they will shout at you. They will, I've only hit once, but I was hit quite hard with a Bible once, but and will command things out of you and get you to basically try and sick it up. For want of, forgive me, it's pretty graphic, but choking it up, spluttering words out. And there were times I really felt, I don't know, I felt I was fighting something, and I was certainly being violently sick, and I was being so sick that I've been shared the story that when I went to the bathroom to look to take a break, because I was feeling pretty awful about all this and frankly quite scared, I looked in the mirror and all the blood vessels around my eyes had burst, and it looked as though I'd been in this terrible fight. And I remember being so shocked and going back into the room to see the person who'd been praying with me and saying, "Gosh, look at my eyes." And she said, "Yeah, no, that's quite normal." But I didn't go. Well, I was staying there. I put on some dark glasses and didn't go out for a week. The shame we're talking about is really deep.
I mean, it is shocking that, and again, I think to a lot of people, they will have no idea that this goes on, but they were trying to make you throw up. I mean, it's literally that physical.
Well, it is, but again, quite seemingly normal. I think sometimes a lot of people in evangelical and charismatic Pentecostal churches live in a parallel universe. You'll go to them, I mean, all over the world, very prevalent in the States too. You've got literally 500 people in a room praying and singing with their arms in the air, very modern music, worshiping God, but all in this sort of well, I don't want to use a rude word, but all in the same space where it's very difficult to be the one person to stand against the tide and go, actually, I don't think this is right. Actually, I don't feel very comfortable here. Actually, I'm not sure that that's actually God. You may have seen pictures of people falling over. We'll talk about the weight of the Holy Spirit coming on someone, and people are prayed for. Very standard at the end of church services in many churches to go forward for prayer, and someone will put their hand and pray on you, especially if it's a leader or someone that you really trust at the front will come and put their hand on the front of your forehead, and you might fall over. Well, the truth is, half the time you're being pushed over. And I more than once stood and looked at a leader in the face and said, "You're not pushing me over. No, I'm not falling to the ground and pretending that I'm being slain in the spirit." Now, there'll be people listening to this, either horrified or going, "Jayne, that's not right. Of course it's the Holy Spirit who's pushing people over." No, I think it's about time the evangelical church got honest with itself about some of what I can only call spiritual abuse. Okay, I do believe that God, I have a deep faith. I do believe that God does speak to people occasionally. I do believe in the gifts of the Holy Spirit, but I think we've turned it into a show of some form, often coming from the right place. But the power dynamics are what worry me most. It's the gurus on the top stage who've got special giftings that we listen to without questioning. And we've seen that coming out recently, sadly, in these terrible stories of sexual abuse of children as well as of adults, where the power dynamics at work have never been questioned. And it's the same for treatment in this area.
So for you, what was the point where you just thought, I can't do this anymore, and you saw through it?
Well, what I haven't mentioned is that I was quite senior within the Church of England and indeed the evangelical world. I was on something called the Archbishop's Council, and that meant that I was often invited to speak or travel around the world. And I did meet so many very senior evangelical leaders who I would ask privately to pray for me. So I'd like to think that virtually anybody who could think that they had a gift in this area had really tried their best, and I claimed it. However, after nearly 10 years of this, when I started a postgrad course here in Oxford University, I found myself in a room with an extraordinary woman who was on my course, and I realized that old butterfly feeling in my stomach. When you falling for someone, we don't have any power over it half the time. And I realized that all those years of prayer had not worked an inch. I was back where I'd always been. And I was really distraught about this because I didn't know what else to do. The advice I was being given was I would have to put up with being single and celibate for the rest of my life. I'd never had a relationship of love, and I desperately wanted that. And I went to see our pastor, the person in charge of pastoral support at the church. I've been reaching out to him to ask for help. And he obviously didn't know what to say. And his final words to me were, "Jayne, I think this is just between you and God now." And I literally felt him closing the metaphorical door on me. He didn't know what to do with me, so he was resigning me and letting me go. And I'd basically gone to him saying, "I can't cope. I'm at the end of myself." And that felt like a massive door slamming in my face. And within a couple of days, I was back in hospital with my body really under a huge amount of strain, going through all sorts of tests, wondering why I was in such agonizing pain. And then I had a second major breakdown. And frankly, I longed to die. I really couldn't see another way out. I've been to that place a few times in my life, but that was probably the darkest one. And I remember thinking, I don't want to die. I want to have a life. And I suppose I squared with myself that if I chose to at least explore who I was, because that was also part of the hell, because we don't believe in sex before marriage as good Christians, I had no idea if what I yearned for, which was a relationship with a woman, would actually satisfy me, or indeed whether it would just be something so horrible and awful that it was literally, I don't know, something just plaguing in my mind. I needed to find out who I was. So I decided to do some market research, as one very dear, well-known lady called Nadia Boltz-Weber said to me. She went out and dated some men and dated some women, and I did. And not, I don't know, but I soon realized that I was far more attracted to women. And yes, I wonderfully met an extraordinary woman very, very, very early on, thank God for me. And she and I fell hopelessly in love and were together for many years. And but at that time, and this is the key thing, I did think that I was sadly walking away from my faith. I did at the time believe that it was completely wrong, sinful to be entering into this relationship. But I couldn't negate this amazing feeling of life, joy, hope. You know, my whole face, evidently, my whole being changed. Anybody who saw me kept saying, "Gosh, Jayne, what's happened to you?" And of course, I couldn't tell them because I hadn't come out to anybody. But it was just written over every aspect of my life that I was suddenly at peace and I'd find hope and joy. And wonderfully for me, I found my faith, my God, the way that I interact with God being just the same as it had always been. Perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, but I truly thought I was walking into the gates of hell at the time. And I met some extraordinary gay Christians or Christians who worked with gay people who helped me start to see scripture with a fresh pair of eyes and trying to, for me, unpick why on earth had I thought and believed the things I had. But I had yet to come out, and that was going to be very costly when I did.
And what was that like when you did come out?
Well, so yeah, good question. I mean, I think the first part is coming out to myself, isn't it? And then trying to come out to my family. But I knew I needed to take the initiative and come out to senior members of the evangelical world and indeed the Church of England. And I really didn't know how to do that. There's a wonderful story. I tell it in my book, Just Love, but well, there's many stories, but I think two things that happened. My then partner and I had gone off to Vienna as a sort of, for me, we'd committed to each other. It was a sort of honeymoon. It was around Valentine's Day. It was a wonderful thing. It was the first time we'd gone away together. And on the plane on the way home, packed plane, but we were one of those lucky ones where you have a row of three and we had a spare seat next to us. I thought, gosh, we can spread out. But just as the plane was about to take off, on rushes this guy, obviously headed towards this one seat. And I suddenly realized he's got a black shirt with a tiny little white piece under his chin, piece of vicar. And I'm holding my partner's hand and I try and let go of it because I sort of half recognize it. I can see he's recognized me. I'm thinking, oh my goodness me. And he sits down and he says, "You're Jayne Ozanne, aren't you?" Like, oh no, because I was quite, I suppose, well known on Archbishop's Council days. And he obviously, I don't know who he is at this point. He does introduce himself. And he obviously realizes exactly what the situation is. And he gives me a lifeline without really, he talks about his own situation. If he's listening to this, I'd love him to be back in touch because he's the first Christian who just gave me hope. He pointed me towards a book that he thought I'd be interested in reading. And in that book, I then met other people I could reach out to hope for help. But when I got back the next day, Bishop James Jones, who was the Bishop of Liverpool, who I'd worked with very closely when I'd been on the Archbishop's Council, he was on Thought for the Day. And he gave a speech about how the evangelical church needed to be less black and white on this and needed to be grey, far more accepting. And I reached out to him and we met literally within a few days in the House of Lords. He'd no idea what I was going to talk to him about, but he was the first, I suppose, person I came out to. And I asked him how I should address coming out to the church. And he suggested I took charge of my story, that I wrote it to everyone, which I did, and that I explained my reasoning for coming out and what my experience had been and the hell I'd been through. And I thought that they would all talk amongst themselves, that it would be one of those sort of secrets that wasn't really a secret that nobody knew about. But actually, For reasons that I think most people didn't know what to say. Nobody talked about it. And so when I came out publicly in 2014, so that was my coming out to friends and family. It was major news. But the problem was when I came out in 2009, very few people wrote back to me. Very few people would talk to me. I did get some letters, which I'm glad of, from people who obviously wrote to me saying they were very worried for my soul, that they were very concerned, I was walking into sin. But it was the silence that hurt me most. People just didn't know what to say, and I just was dropped like a stone. And there are people to this day who've never spoken to me since. And, I might keep sending Christmas cards, I might try and reach out. And that's deeply painful.
I mean, you have been through such a lot, Jayne, but what's incredible is that you've come out so strongly from it, and you've set up your own foundation now, and you have tirelessly campaigned for other people who are going through this, and you've achieved a ban. I mean, we need to talk now about the shape of that ban, but you have got a ban into the Queen's speech, and the government has committed to it. So let's have a little look at that ban, because there was a bit of disappointment, wasn't there, this week, because it talks about coercive practices. Why don't you think that goes far enough?
Gosh, it doesn't even scrape the top of it. As I've explained, I willingly put myself through this because everybody in my immediate circle, in my bubble, if you like, believed exactly the same, that being gay was sinful. And so I believed I was doing the right thing by putting myself through all of this. And that will be the case of frankly, most Christian LGBT people you speak to. They will all willingly choose it, but it's not actually a choice, because to not choose it is to be rejected, to be dropped like a stone by friends and family alike, by your support bubble, by everybody you know. You have to walk away from them all. And the cost is very high. And it's far too high for young adults who've yet to even embark and create their own sense of security. But actually, the concept of consent is a misnomer anyway. You cannot legally consent to abuse. The government has a duty. It is obliged under law to protect its citizens from abuse, from themselves. They cannot put themselves through torture. So it, to me, is yet another example of how the government has not listened to the voice of survivors, that it is listening to religious leaders who they don't want to quote offend, but who are the perpetrators, who are doing this, and not understanding the whole context, the grooming, because it is grooming. In a sense, it's what you're taught from an early age. You have no other way out apart from going through this prayer or accepting that you have to be single and celibate for life. And that is a death sentence for so many people. I say that with feeling, because I know too many people who have felt that the only way out is to take their lives.
And you're absolutely right that the suicide rate amongst LGBT people is twice the rate that it is in the heterosexual population, and that is probably partly because of the shame and the religious dimension for some of them. But as someone with a strong faith still to this day, can you sympathise with some people from Christianity and other religions who say, look, we need to protect our religious freedoms here, because whilst some of them agree quite strongly with a ban on conversion therapy, they're worried that maybe it might infringe on their ability just to sit down with someone and say, look, actually, there's a couple of passages of the Bible here that aren't particularly supportive of homosexuality, and that's what I believe, but you go away and have a think about it yourself. I suppose they're worried that they might be silenced and not able to express their beliefs anymore.
Well, there's a difference here between expressing beliefs and preaching to the multitudes, if you like, and then targeting a practice at an individual where you are influencing them because you have a power dynamic, frankly, because you're their leader, and you're telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And if you're telling them that they cannot be gay, that is abusive, it's wrong, and needs to be banned. If you're creating a safe space for them to explore who they are and telling them it's absolutely fine, whoever they are, but you want to pray for them to come to a point of peace, or you want to help guide them to know that they are wonderfully made, that they are equally loved by God, that it doesn't matter who you are, but the importance is the quality of the love, not the person that you love. That safe space, that spiritual guidance, that prayer is appropriate and right and good and proper. But as I say, if it's a preconditioned outcome where you're telling someone that they are sinful and wrong, that will lead that person to a very dark place. And it's time religions got honest about this. People will call me a campaigner. I'm a survivor trying to stop other people getting hurt. I'm motivated by my faith because I believe we need to protect the vulnerable. And for too long, I'm afraid, homophobic and transphobic teaching and preaching has had the protection of the state. Now, the UN is really clear that religious practice that causes harm must and should be limited. Freedom of religion is not an absolute right. And actually, people need to really start to understand law a lot better. The fundamental right is to life. And anything that undermines that right to life is something that has to be limited. Of course, we can all believe and think in our internal space, whatever we like. It's the practicing of that that has to be limited. And we as a society, I think, need to have a very serious conversation about spiritual abuse, about the dark side of religion. We see it in many forms. We've seen it, in forced marriage, female genital mutilation, hate preaching. There's all sorts, sexual abuse, there's all sorts of dark side, domestic abuse. And religions for too long have been left to police themselves. And we've seen the disastrous results of that. And Archbishop Rowan Williams spoke at a briefing very recently that was organised for parliamentarians, and he talked about the need for independent assessment in the cases of spiritual abuse. And I fully back him on that. But conversion therapy is a form of spiritual abuse.
So if there was one thing that you could do to improve the ban as Prime Minister, don't forget, what would you do?
Well, I'd recognise the term spiritual abuse. I'd broaden it out. I'd look at how we deal, we work with religions to recognise that this is an issue in many forms, and look at how we define it and how we put in protections against it. And therefore, for conversion therapy, which is a form of spiritual abuse, that would naturally fall under there. And we wouldn't get into this, tit for tat debate as to whether we can pray or can't. We just call it what it is, spiritual abuse. So for me, we look at emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse in society. What we don't have is a definition or guidelines about how we protect people from spiritual abuse. And that would then be used by the police, by the NHS, by doctors, by teachers who could look out for it. It would transform the way that minorities, vulnerable minorities, feel in society, and I think would give us some safeguards that would be good for the future.
And lastly, looking at the future, do you have hope that the government will implement a meaningful ban?
Well, I have hope ultimately that the right thing will happen, because I think history shows that the arc of history is always towards justice. Whether this government will implement a meaningful ban, I'm afraid to say no. I'm not very helpful. I have spoken out quite a lot now about what I see as a hostile environment for LGBT people. I don't see the government engaging enough with the LGBT community to understand the reality of life on the ground. I think their ears are being bent by right-wing evangelicals. I'd like to hope that Prime Minister Boris Johnson will do the right thing. I think he is socially liberal. I think he does genuinely want to protect people. But I'm not convinced that everybody in the system under him is working in that same direction. So time will only tell, but goodness, we will be there shouting either from the sidelines or hopefully still within government if they'll create an advisory board again to ensure that the right thing is done.
Well, look, Jayne Ozanne, thank you for all the campaigning that you do. You've been an incredibly strong voice for the LGBT community, and who knows, perhaps we'll see you popping up in politics. I mean, this is a theoretical podcast, but I wouldn't be surprised to see you in the House of Lords or something similar sometime soon. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's just been so interesting to talk to you.
Thank you, Paul.